When we hear about Stalin, the first thing that comes to mind for reasonable people is the image of a tyrant who caused the deaths of millions. But even those who agree with this still imagine an ordinary man in a field jacket without any medals, as if he didn't need anything at all. Worn-out boots and a cap. And the vast majority believe that he was just that simple. He slept on a simple bed, ate simple food, and of course never lived in luxury. Those were different times, not like today's oligarchs living in luxury. But today, I'll lift the veil for you. And relying on facts, secret documents, and testimonies from the closest circle of the leader of the people, I'll tell you how and where Stalin lived, how many dakas and villas were built for him, what cars he used, and other unknown facts from his biography. My name is Semyon, this is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's begin. Subtitles by Dima Torzar. The myth of asceticism in Stalin's house or dacha. Especially for Iosif Vissarionovich, during his rule, 3 dakas were built near Moscow, 10 more in the Caucasus, and 4 in Crimea. Such Caucasian dakas as Novaya Matsesta and Blinovka in Sochi, Kolodnaya Rechka in Gagra, Skaltubo and Borjomi in Georgia, as well as Sukhumi and New Athos in Abkhazia, each had 2 floors. By the way, regarding the last inspection, of the listed dakas, Stalin visited there only once and refused to live there, despite the fact that a secret passage to the sea was made specifically for his needs. As for the Crimean dachas, here we can mention the 2-story dacha called Trapeznikova, where Stalin vacationed in the early 1930s, as well as another one called Yavenaya, which was single-story, and he never actually visited it, even though it was built especially for him. But the General Secretary often visited the Kore's dacha. He lived there during the Yalta Conference in 1945. It was a 2-story building with an area of about 600 square meters. The most famous of Stalin's dakas is probably the Kuntsevo daka near Moscow, which those around him called the Blizhnyaya, or the near daka. It was there that Iosif Vissarionovich lived continuously for 20 years. The total area of this 2-story mansion was almost more than 1,000 square meters. Quite modest. По-простому. In addition to this, the leader of the people also had 2 more dachas near Moscow at his disposal. The Semyonovskaya, known as the Fardaka, with an area of 800 square meters, and Zubalova, a 2-story one, about 500 square meters and consisting of 12 rooms. By the way, the kind-hearted Stalin declared his chief architect, who built this and other dakas for him, an enemy of the people in 1943. And along with his colleagues and wife, he sent them to the camps. The total area of just the living quarters of Stalin's 20 dachas is almost 7,000 square meters. Now, perhaps in the photos, they don't look as luxurious as the dakas of today's elite. Besides, the buildings are already hundreds of years old and many have already been abandoned. But at that time, when most Soviet people lived in communal apartments and millions were eating camp rations for trumped-up charges, Vissarionovich was truly living it up. I have a separate interesting story about Stalin's bravery. But for now, let's confirm his so-called bravery with the fact that all his dakas were painted green. The leader was afraid of shelling. Bunkers were dug under some of the dakas, and an area of 100 hectares around each daka was surrounded by several types of fences and rows of barbed wire. These dakas were guarded no worse than secret laboratories. NKVD units were stationed several kilometers away. Anti-aircraft defenses protected the area, closing these zones to flights. Behind the fence began the inner perimeter, which was controlled exclusively by Stalin's personal security. When he arrived at one of his many dakas, he would bring along a whole crowd of Chekists with him. In addition, Stalin, who was portrayed by propaganda as absolutely ascetic, had no qualms about having service staff at each of his dakas. While the leader of the nation was taking a walk, he had maids, cooks, waiters, nurses, drivers, gardeners, groundskeepers, a barber, and even a toxicologist working for him, who checked whether the food on his table had been poisoned. I'll tell you a bit later about how the leader dined. There's really no other word for it. But it can be said for certain that whenever the leader of the communist state, whose ideology was based on the prohibition of man exploiting man, was at one of his dakas, he was surrounded by no fewer than 50 staff members. By the way, they used exactly this word to distinguish it from the old bourgeois term, servants. Although, as we can see, the essence didn't change at all. A few years ago, Navalny's investigation revealed the luxury and excess of Putin's Sochi palace. So, Stalin, whom Putin wants to resemble in one way or another, was actually not that different. For example, his Abkhazian dachas had porcelain bathtubs, where the required water temperature was specially maintained for several hours. And not just any water, but seawater, which was specially delivered by his order so that the leader, who suffered from bouts of rheumatism, could get some treatment. By the way, to make it more comfortable and easier for Comrade Stalin to climb the stairs, the height of the steps was specially reduced. Among the decorative elements of the fardacha, there is a fireplace in the large dining room, decorated with onyx and opal, and a second one made of gray marble in the small dining room. All the furniture in the bedroom was made of plane tree wood, a rare and therefore quite expensive wood. In addition, pine, walnut, and boxwood were used in the finishing of each room. The design was handled by a Moscow factory that worked on government orders. The myth of modesty in food, or how the leader dined. At the very time when Stalin's dearly beloved Soviet people were dying by the millions from hunger, and not for natural reasons, but for reasons artificially created by Stalin himself, Yosif Vissarionovich was throwing feasts for himself. And what feasts they were! Here is a quote I found from Doctor of Historical Sciences Sergei Anastasovich Mikoyan, who describes Stalin's dinners like this. They started at 10 or 11 in the evening and ended at 3 or 4 in the morning. There would be, say, 8, 10, or 12 people gathered. Exquisite dishes were served in large quantities. Champagne, cognac, the best Georgian wines, and vodka flowed freely. The host himself didn't drink that much, preferring sweet champagne and wines like Kvanchkara. But he made others drink based on the saying that what a sober person has on their mind, a drunk person has on their tongue. He saw refusing to drink as a fear of letting something slip or a desire to hide something. Spare clean plates, utensils, crystal wine glasses. They were set and placed nearby so that the staff wouldn't bustle around during conversations. Sometimes the host would suddenly say 2 words in Georgian, which translated as new tablecloth or fresh tablecloth. Immediately the staff would appear, grab the tablecloth by its 4 corners and lift it up. All the contents, caviar mixed with slightly cooled cutlets, Gurian-style cabbage with fried partridges, along with the dishes, utensils, and glasses would end up bundled together, with only the sound of broken porcelain and crystal ringing out, and it would all be carried away. On a new, clean tablecloth, they would bring other dishes, freshly prepared and favored by Stalin. Here is another account, this time from Stalin's daughter, Svetlana Alliluyeva. Father didn't spend money himself. He had nowhere and nothing to spend it on. All his living arrangements, dachas, houses, servants, food, clothing, all of this was paid for by the state. Fish was brought to his table. Fish from special ponds, pheasants and lambs from special farms. Specially bottled Georgian wine and fresh fruit were delivered from the south by plane. And he didn't pay a single penny for any of it. The amounts were enormous. Even Stalin's chief of security, State Security General Vlasic, said, "I managed millions on his behalf." Since we've touched on this topic, according to official data, in 1947 Stalin, as chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, received a salary of 10,000 rubles per month, and another 10,000 for the position of first secretary of the Central Committee of the VKPB. To put it in perspective, for that amount of money at the time, you could buy 2 Pobeda cars. We'll talk about Stalin's favorite cars separately later. And now, let's return to his official income. These include royalties from publishing books. And despite all this, there isn't a single document confirming that kind old Grandpa Stalin, who was ready to give away his last worn-out overcoat, ever donated even a ruble from his personal income to help orphanages or war invalids. On the contrary, he exiled people crippled by the war he helped start beyond the 101st kilometer. By the way, I already released a video about this on my channel, which you can watch. It describes these events in detail. Also, during Stalin's rule, all Soviet citizens who worked were required to buy government bonds, spending up to 70% of their salary on this during the war, and at least 30% after the war. Stalin himself never spent a single penny of his salary on these bonds. The trip to Potsdam. Using just one event as an example, I will reveal the true picture behind the supposed modesty of the Soviet leader. To do this, I will try to briefly describe the contents of the memorandum written by Beria and kept in the State Archive of the Russian Federation. It talks about the special preparations made by the NKVD of the USSR for receiving and accommodating the Soviet delegation and personally Stalin and Molotov at the Potsdam Conference in 1945. Among other things, the memorandum mentions the preparation of villas with a total area of 10,000 square meters. A two-story mansion was prepared for Stalin himself, which consisted of 15 rooms with open verandas. A two-story building with 11 rooms was prepared for Molotov, and for the delegation, 55 villas were prepared, including 8 mansions. In the same memo, Beria reported that the mansion for Stalin was fully supplied. Stocks of game, groceries, delicatessen products, as well as beverages had been created. In addition, 3 auxiliary farms were established 7 kilometers from Potsdam with livestock, poultry farms, and vegetable storage facilities. There were also 2 bakeries operating there. Lavrenti Pavlovich noted that all the staff would be brought from Moscow. 2 special airfields were on standby in the vicinity of the mansions. Regarding security, the note states that 7 regiments of NKVD troops and 1,500 operational personnel were brought to Germany. Security was organized in 3 rings. To prepare for the transfer of Stalin with his entire entourage, a special train was prepared, and along the nearly 2,000-kilometer route, 17,000 soldiers and officers of the NKVD troops provided security. On every kilometer of the railway, there were up to 15 security personnel and 8 NKVD armored trains patrolled along the route. It's immediately obvious, just an ordinary man, not afraid of anything at all. Speaking of this trait, I managed to find a particularly telling example. The myth of bravery. So I'd like to debunk another myth about Stalin, specifically that he was a brave military leader. If you look at wars of past centuries, for most people this word implies a daring commander on horseback leading the army from the front. But there is no documented case of Stalin during World War II, or especially the Finnish war he started, ever being anywhere near the front line. Of course, his propaganda spread information among the soldiers that in July 1941 he supposedly came to the defensive line near Mozhaisk and even held a meeting with the command there. He supposedly traveled the whole front line, and in the fall, secretly hiding from most of his entourage, he visited the Volokolamsk and Maloyaroslavets defensive lines. Not Stalin, but more like Figaro from Rossini's opera. But, by the way, I think if there was even a single photo of the head of the Council of People's Commissars at the front, it would have been published in every newspaper. So for now, we have to settle for imaginary pictures in our heads. Well, you can also create them with AI these days. All this is done deliberately to maintain the belief among soldiers that Stalin is with them. By the way, we see a similar situation in 2025 as well. People are being fed canned footage under the pretense of Putin visiting Kursk. That's what journalists call a pre-recorded segment that's pushed to air whenever it's needed. Supposedly it was him, but in reality it was someone who looked like the old Russian dictator who came almost to the front line. 85 years have passed, but the methods of propaganda are still at the same level. But let's go back to 1943. There is only one documented trip that could barely be considered Stalin's close approach to the front line. The report about that trip is kept in the Moscow archive and is dated August 1943. The trip was made to the reserve area, and according to the aforementioned report, the brave leader of the people traveled through the deep rear areas of the Kalinin front, about 70 kilometers from the nearest fighting. This trip is also confirmed by Anastas Mikoyan in his book. Here is a quote from there. When the Germans had already retreated from Moscow, he traveled in an armored Packard along the Minsk highway, since it was controlled by our troops. A rumor was deliberately spread among the units that Stalin had gone to the front, but in reality, he never made it to the front. Nature called, perhaps even out of fear. I can't call him too brave. He asked the guards if the area in the bushes was mined, but no one could guarantee that it was completely clear. Then, in front of his subordinates, the commander-in-chief took off his pants and did his business right on the road. That was the end of his acquaintance with the front, and he went back to Moscow. End of quote. Huh. A brave man among the brave, though. The car fleet. As I promised, I'll tell you about another aspect of Stalin's life, where you can also see that the image of a poor leader in a simple suit is just an element of propaganda that has nothing to do with reality. I've already mentioned the armored Packard. So, during the so-called Civil War, the future General Secretary received a truly luxurious 12-cylinder Packard Twin 6. It was quite a fast car. Its maximum speed was about 130 km/h. Upon returning to Moscow, Stalin immediately asked the head of the Council of People's Commissars' garage to find a car of the same brand, and of course they provided him with a suitable car. And Comrade Zhugashvili used it with pleasure. In the fall of 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States gave Stalin a gift, an armored Franklin limousine Packard 12. Specifically for the General Secretary, this car was fitted with armor protection and was repainted black. In the 4 years leading up to 1941, about 8,000 Soviet cars of various modifications were produced at the Stalin factory. A quote from Stalin is well known, saying that the use of American cars is a bad example and that it damages the reputation of the workers and peasants' state. But even so, he himself did not give up his armored Packard. In addition, Stalin had cars specially designed for him. One of these was the ZIS-115, an armored limousine with a luxurious interior. The car's interior was finished with genuine leather, velour, and inserts of Korean birch, and the cabin was equipped with an air conditioner. The seats in the car were filled with eiderdown and upholstered with cloth. Also, in addition to luxury, this car had protective features, namely the so-called armored capsule. It was manufactured under the name Product No. 100 by employees of a military facility near Podolsk. The limousine, which was actually a 5-ton armored vehicle, protected the people inside from automatic and machine gun bullets, as well as from mines and grenades. And you know what's funny? In the article where I found this very information is presented in Lesnoy. It mentions the fact of creating an armored capsule. Right there's a supposed quote from Stalin claiming he has nothing to hide from the people. Therefore, there's no need for a glass partition between the front and rear parts of the car. How does she manage to have both of these things in her head at the same time? I have no idea. Only 32 of these cars were produced, and all of them were exclusively at the personal disposal of Stalin. About 10 cars were in Moscow, 2 in Leningrad, and the rest were located in Crimea, the North Caucasus, Sochi, and Transcaucasia. But even having specially made ZIS-115 armored cars, Stalin did not completely give up his Packards. You can see it right away. The man hates the West with all his soul. This really reminds me of modern Russian officials and Putin himself, who constantly criticize and bash the West at every opportunity. But at the same time, they drive Western cars, and their children study in Europe and America. You could say that this sense of greatness was inherited by the Russian authorities from the Soviet era. In 1949, the Czechoslovak leadership presented Stalin with a white Tatra 600 convertible for his 70th birthday, custom-built as a one-of-a-kind vehicle. But since that car did not meet safety requirements, Iosif Vissarionovich did not even speak about it. He also never rode in that gift. I've already told you about the courage of the Generalissimo. Here's another example for your collection. This is an excerpt from Zhukov's memoirs, who often accompanied the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Stalin told me to sit in the back seat. We arranged ourselves as follows. In the front was the Chief of Personal Security, Vlasik. In the middle was Stalin, and behind him was me. I asked Vlasik why he put me there. It's simple. If someone shot from the front, they would hit me, and if from the back, they would hit you. Conclusions. Someone might say, even after hearing all the previous facts, nowadays, a person earning a couple thousand euros a month lives much better than Stalin did. However, it's important to understand that everything is relative. And precisely in comparison with Soviet people, the poor, simple leader of the people lived 1,000 times better. Even the Western leaders of those years, who were criticized for everything possible, the imperialist bourgeois, could not afford such luxury, having 24 dachas, a security staff of thousands, and a fleet of dozens of cars. But the so-called poor Stalin could. At the same time, to maintain his image, he would appear before the people in a tattered overcoat and worn-out boots. But, arriving at the mausoleum on Red Square in a car with an armored capsule... That's all from me. I invite everyone to the comments. Goodbye, everyone.